Here we go again. And so soon after Vietnam, so soon after deceit in the highest quarters, here we go again. And the commentators, radio, TV, newspaper journalists, cartoonists, with few exceptions, are at it again. We got to stop them in Africa. Before we had to stop them in Southeast Asia. And something went wrong on the way. Something in the very beginning went wrong. And now we got to stop them. And now it's all about Zaire and the Cubans and the Soviets. And I thought perhaps we should get a more clear-eyed view, perhaps, from John Stockwell. Who's John Stockwell? Well, John Stockwell was the former chief of the CIA Angola Task Force, and he has decided to, as several others have done, blow the whistle. And his book is called In Search of Enemies. And it's the spring of 1975 on the cover. As Saigon falls, the CIA destabilizes Angola in preparation for the next war. That's John Stockwell's reflections. Norton, the publisher, of the book In Search of Enemies, and chapter and verse, he cites what he's seen, indeed, and what he's been involved. And so, in a moment, a conversation with John Stockwell, former CIA chief of the Angola Task Force, after this message.
In January 1978, President Carter announced a reorganization of the intelligence community, which in fact has the effect of strengthening the CIA. And Admiral Turner has reached an understanding with Congress, of which I am skeptical. The Congress has neither the will nor the means to control the CIA. Now Turner has intensified his campaign for tighter controls over CIA employees. He is lobbying vigorously for legislation that would jail anyone who threatens the CIA by disclosing its secrets. It makes him fighting mad. He blusters when anyone leaks classified information. Such people are violating the code of intelligence, he charges. It is the CIA's unequivocal right to censor all publications by CIA people, he claims. Why do Americans automatically presume the worst of their public servants, he asks. A remarkable question in the wake of Watergate, FBI, and CIA revelations. Director Turner and President Carter have it backwards. It is the American people's unequivocal right to know what their leaders are doing in America's name and with our tax dollars. If the present administration has its way, stories such as this one would be suppressed and covered up. The author would be jailed. I invite the reader to judge which is more important, CIA misadventures such as this one, or our fundamental right to know the truth about our public servants' activities and to keep them honest.
And those are passages from the author's note, read by the author himself, John Stockwell. And it's a devastating book, In Search of Enemies, a CIA story. So Mr. Stockwell is among several now who've blown the whistle, CIA. What do they call it again? Case officers.
Case officers, yeah.
Now, John, we start with you, John Stockwell. Who is John Stockwell? Because we're going to cite your credentials here.
Well, I grew up in the Congo, which is now Zaire, not too many miles from where the fighting is currently.
Your father was working for...
He was an engineer who contracted with the Presbyterian Mission to build a hydroelectric plant for him, which he did, and he built some other things, and I lived my childhood there. And then I did college in the States, and I did a tour with the United States Marine Corps, and worked for a while with the Gates Rubber Company in Denver, Colorado. And then the CIA recruited me, and since then I sort of made my way up to a certain level at which, in the end, I was in Africa for 3 tours, and then I was in Vietnam for the last 2 years of our participation in that country's problems. And then I came back to run the CIA's Angola Task Force.
And so, when Vietnam, the end of the war, you were there, and you tell about this in the beginning. Then you got a call.
Yeah.
Then you got the call. Angola next. Is that
Angola
next
yeah.
stop? Yeah.
Yeah. When we came out of Vietnam, you know, they closed down 3 big stations: Saigon, Phnom Penh, and Vientiane, and big upcountry programs. They had over 1,000 officers descend on CIA headquarters, and they didn't have enough people to process our travel claims, much less desks and jobs for us. So they said, "Go home, and we'll call you." And so I had a windfall of about 3 months leave, administrative leave. And when they called me, they said, "Get up to Washington today. We need you." And I got a plane and went up to Washington. And the first thing they told me was that I was chief of the Angola Task Force. And of course, this was really kind of shocking and horrifying, because I and my colleagues had figured that after Vietnam, the United States wouldn't be in a paramilitary operation for another 10 or 20 years, that we had surely learned our lessons by then. And here, 3 months almost to the day from when the last helicopter left the embassy rooftop in Saigon, we were launching another covert paramilitary operation in Angola.
Well, you speak of a covert military operation in Angola. Could you do in your book, cite chapter and verse. What did they tell you you're to do?
Well, what they said was that the Soviets were trying to take over Angola through their liberation movement, which was the MPLA, and that our objective was to block them, to check them for a few months until elections could be held, and then we didn't know what would happen after that point.
There were three groups. There was the MPLA,
and the FNLA and UNITA. And basically it wound up with us, with the FNLA and UNITA, and the MPLA on the other side, supported by a number of countries, including the Soviet Union and Cuba.
Yeah. Now the craziness is, in some of the instances, we were on the same side as North Korea.
Oh.
And China, of course.
Crazy, and Romania and Tanzania and South Africa all fighting on the same side.
And
against
North Korea, too.
North Korea.
On our side.
Yeah, we used, when our allies attacked the capital of Luanda in early November of 75.
This is when the MPLA, the Soviet-backed NATO president, NHETO, had it. You go ahead, I'm sorry.
Well, when we attacked Luanda, we had North Korean 130-millimeter cannon, and we had Chinese tanks. On our side, fighting the MPLA with sometimes the same weapons, except they had much better weapons.
I know this is a battle of what we call the free world.
Oh.
So here we go again. South Africa, of course, too.
Yeah, South Africa came in. Of course, when South Africa came in, and it became clear what we were doing, then a lot of people fell away from our side. The Chinese withdrew, the North Koreans withdrew, the Romanians weren't heard from again. Tanzania, Nigeria, key African countries dropped us cold.
But let's go back to the beginning, because not chronologically, but here it is, your now meeting. There's a chapter called The Kissinger Grunt, and you have to outline this. You now being briefed, and a lot of big shots are there, before you go to Angola, take over this job.
Yeah, the Kissinger Grunt occurred when actually later on, I use it as a prologue just to sort of establish what we're doing and the mentality of such a war. We are getting beaten soundly by late November in Angola, and for our first we had a no-win policy.
You say we are beaten soundly. You mean
our allies.
The FLNA is holding Roberto.
That's right. And
does he have much popular support in Angola?
No, not at all. But UNITA down south did.
Yeah. Savimbi, the other group, had. But Roberto was he was a CIA creature.
He was a CIA ally, collaborator, yes.
Was he created by CIA? Or?
No, he was legitimately the leader of his Bakongo people, but he came to us looking for support and accepted a relationship with the CIA in his own interest.
Now, I suppose just to set it straight, as the Angolan setup, he had a group of people, Roberto.
Yeah. He had... you have three basic ethnic groupings in Angola and a lot of subunits, but you have the Kimbundu in the central part of the country, which were the heart group support of the MPLA. In the north, you had Bakongo peoples, and amongst those people, the FNLA was formed. And the southern half of the country was more or less loyal to Savimbi, and these were the Ovimbundu peoples.
And that's the UNITA group.
That's the UNITA group.
And MPLA, how do they differ from the other two in the makeup?
Well, all three of the groups had about the same objectives over the years, which is to evict the Portuguese and to socialize the country to a certain extent. Savimbi was traditionally the most radical of the three. Roberto's forces were the most bloody. They killed more people, white and black,
now,
than the others put together.
You'll go slow on this one. Roberto's group is the one the CIA backed.
That's right.
And that's the most bloodiest.
That's the bloodiest, and the one that killed, in the history of their war, killed by far the most whites and blacks and other groups, was the least cooperative of the bunch. The MPLA had the most outspoken Marxists in their group, and this was part of the rationale for opposing them. It was easy to brand them as more radical because of their Marxist backgrounds, which was a false conclusion. They did everything they could at the outset to convince us, not just tell us, but to convince us that they wanted a multiracial solution in Angola, and that they wanted to do business with the United States, and they did not want to be pushed into the Soviet camp.
By the way, in your book you cite this often, that the MPLA the ones we were fighting, wanted to ally. They want to be non-aligned with anybody, but they wanted peace, and we refused every time, particularly Kissinger.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. That's why I call my book In Search of Enemies. These people were not our enemies. It was not necessary that they be our enemies. They didn't want to be our enemies. We made them into our enemies. We wanted to fight.
Is it to save face, some face after Vietnam?
I concluded that it was just a macho ego thing wanting to confront the Soviets. See, what blows up the whole theory that this was a necessary move to stop a Soviet move in Angola is the fact that the Soviets weren't there first. China was, and the United States. And this is back in the summer of 74. We bought in on the side of the FNLA in July of 74. Later, the Soviets came into the conflict.
You better say this slowly because, you know, since we've been getting this every day on TV and radio, I think you ought to repeat this about who was there and how it began. You know.
Well, in April of 1974, there was a coup in Portugal, which was significant because it was a military coup, a military revolt almost. The military was tired of the colonial wars. They took over the Portuguese government and established their loss of determination to hold on to these colonies. So the three movements began contending for control of the country instead of to oust the Portuguese. In May of 74, a month later, the Chinese went in with 112 advisors to the FNLA, Roberto's people. 2 months later, we went in with support to Roberto, whom we had known for 15 years and given money to and talked to. The Soviet Union wasn't supporting anybody at that time. They had broken with the MPLA. For 2 years they had become disgusted with them and they had broken with them. In August, the Soviet Union announced its support of the MPLA, and in September it began a trickle of arms to the MPLA. So we have a situation here where independence is afoot, probably going to happen in the next year. China deals itself in, we deal ourselves in, and then the Soviets follow. Then later we try to claim that we're there to stop the Soviets.
Yeah.
It just simply wasn't true.
You know, there's a madness here also involving, if I get the Ethiopian-Somalia battle. Originally, the Soviets backed Somalia.
Yes.
And then they switched to Ethiopia.
And for 50 years, we had backed Ethiopia with army, material, everything.
And now we switched to Somalia.
Yeah.
Because the Soviets are backing Ethiopia.
Exactly.
Now, this is a nutty thing. This is kind of wild, burlesque cartoon. I can see this now. So, because they're doing it, it's if they came out against cancer, we'd come out for cancer.
More or less, yeah. We don't have a policy in Africa except to oppose the Soviets and the Cubans.
I want to go back to, but throughout, the MPLA throughout wanted peace, wanted to be non-aligned, wanted peace certainly with the U.S., and every time, specifically Kissinger, since he did wanted battle, wanted let's fight.
Yeah, wanted to confront the Soviets in Africa.
Yeah.
As he huffed that we have to stop the Soviets anywhere they make a move in the world. I never knew, since Kissinger didn't confide in anyone, least of all me, I never knew if he really knew what was going on in Angola. Advisors close to him said he didn't, that he was notoriously poorly read in on Africa.
You know, you're talking about someone who knew it very well, Barbara McElhenney. Who's Barbara McElhenney?
Well, this was a functionary in the Angola desk, the Angolan operations.
And she knew her stuff pretty well, I take it.
Well, she had just not quite gotten her PhD, and she had an exceptionally good mind and a mind capable of thinking a little bit.
But you quote her here, and she's saying that the MPLA was best qualified to run Angola, and its leaders sincerely wanted a peaceful relationship with the U.S. And then the FLNA group, Holden Roberto's group, had few educated men, no intellectuals, much of history in cocktail parties in Kinshasa. And then she goes on, that she scoffs at the notion that you, at the time, not knowing, she said the MPLA leaders were hostile to U.S. Not so, she says. It was the CIA's historical relationship with Roberto had us so close to the FLNA. And then she goes on talking about this. So those who seem to be in the know were saying this is kind of on the nutty side.
Barbara McElhenney was one inside the CIA, and she expressed things so well in such depth that I quoted her conversations. But there were a number of us in there. Another individual named, whom I call Carl Benham. These are all fictitious names. I don't want to hurt the individuals involved. But Carl Benham and I used to talk by the hour about the stupidity of what we were doing. He and I had both been involved in Southeast Asia and the programs there. He'd spent 18 years there, risen to the grade of GS-17, had seen us lose 3 covert wars in Southeast Asia. And he was wringing his hands. He couldn't believe we were doing it again. Essentially, in the end, he was a good soldier, though. As he would tell me on occasion, he would say, look, you know, we're not really paid to have these conversations. We're paid
I'm trying to figure something. Now, here are you. By the way, I should point out that my guest is John Stockwell, who was the former chief CIA of the Angola Task Force, CIA chief of Angola, and he's blowing the whistle, as a number of others. His book is In Search of Enemies, and Norton, the publishers. You haven't been in, I'm thinking about TV right now and the channels, and there's a touch of hysteria in the air again, and the talks, the fist-shaking talks, and you haven't been on any of these programs.
Well, I've been on a lot of programs, including, of course, 60 Minutes. I have not been on a national program in the last few days since the Shaba thing has become so dramatic.
I want to ask you about that Shaba thing. I'm sorry.
I did, well, in all fairness, I testified to the House Committee on African Affairs, and I believe one of the networks ran a bit of my testimony.
On that subject, you might be wandering back and forth. There'll be free association on Congress and how Congress is, in a sense, and at the moment. But for a time, it seemed that CIA was on the run, was exposed by the Church and Pike committees. Now, something funny's happened on the way to that forum, hasn't it?
Yeah, they sort of got it out of their systems to, as it was put, to pick on the CIA, and so they've pulled back. But nothing has been corrected. The offices that were traditionally supposed to control the CIA and did not have been renamed, and they're not controlling the CIA now. The situation, nothing has changed. There are some changes. The Attorney General now has a legal responsibility to supervise the agency's internal domestic operations. Now, this means that if they do something like these sick drug experiments on unwitting Americans, slipping them LSD and then filming their reactions, supposedly the Attorney General would supposedly know about it and supposedly prosecute. But so maybe they won't be quite as adventurous in that score, but they have offices, bases, they call them, field stations, all over the United States. Every major campus in this country is covered by a CIA case officer.
Now, too?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. Down in Dallas, there are 6 case officers covering the Southwest Conference.
What do they do?
Well, their job is to go in and seek students whom they can recruit, mostly non-American students, but they work through American professors to find students from other countries that
They're
they
still
can
working with academics.
Oh, yes.
So the universities are cooperating.
Some universities are definitely cooperating. They're still very active in this field. This means that when foreign students come over here to study and they go back and tell tales about the CIA being everywhere, don't scoff at them if you hear this, and don't say that's sour grapes or communist propaganda. It's true. They offered me a job at one time in Dallas, which I turned down. I would have gone around with 6 business cards in my pocket, and flown from university to university, and going in on people that we had spotted. Hitting them with a business card, each one with a different name and a different story, pretending to be someone I was not, trying to recruit them. And then, if you get past the first stages of rapport and they accept some kind of relationship, well, then you.
So after all the exposés, nothing much has really happened. Their CIA is as good a shape as ever.
Yeah, the CIA's got some problems now in terms of morale. And in terms of feeling that it's no longer loved by America, it's no longer the elite. But nothing really has changed. As they gleefully point out, their recruitments are as high as ever. They have 30,000 a year applicants. But as I point out, what does that really mean? The Ku Klux Klan is at an all-time high, and so is the Gestapo Party. And so I think if the Mafia hung out shingles in every campus in the United States and said that that's all lies that you hear, we're really a clean organization, there's a lot of money in this business, but it's honest money, they get a lot of recruitments too.
I'm thinking, John Stockwell, we got to go back to, as you say, there's certain fat-headedness here too, as well as venality. And so we go back to we had dropped that shoe. The Kissinger grunt early in the author's note. Perhaps we should act this out. So you're called before this group, and among them is Assistant Secretary. There's Mulcahy, His job is, these are names I know you, but Mulcahy is what? He's a member of the State Department.
Well, Mulcahy is a true name. This is Ambassador Ed Mulcahy,
Mm-hmm.
who was the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs.
And Potts is there.
And Jim Potts is a true name. He's a public figure, the chief of the Africa Division of the CIA. He was the three-star general running this war. This meeting where this Kissinger grunt took place was, this is a subcommittee of the National Security Council meeting to supervise the war. We're losing. We had presented a paper to Kissinger said, you know, I want to win. I want to win. And so we're supposed to go back and come up with plans of things we can do to reverse the tide.
He said, I want to win. He said, even though the opposition, so-called the MPLA, wanted peace. The hell with that.
Except at that point, in reaction to our program and the South Africans, we now have 10,000 Cubans in the country, and they are winning. We have
now, the Cubans, how did they come in?
They were flown in on an Operation Carlotta airlift in response to our putting in Zarian troops.
Well, now, they come in response to something we did.
Oh, yes, absolutely. I tracked this in the book very carefully, the chronology of the dates, how many there were at X time, and then how many came in when and in reaction to what.
But throughout your book, and this is something, by the way, that Premier Julius Nyerere of Tanzania, perhaps most respected of all the African statesmen, has said, everything they've done has been in response to something we've done.
Yes. Yes,
and they've been invited in, by the way.
Quite. Absolutely. Of course, the administration argues that we're invited in. Mobutu's invited us into the Shaba. But there is a difference in acceptability. The Cuban... Recently, in the world newspapers, there were pictures of white soldiers flown in by the CIA, by the United States, standing over blacks who were cowering on the ground, groveling for their lives. Now, this is absolutely horrible propaganda for the United States. We just can't have that kind of front-page pictures of our programs. Cuba never gets itself into a position where its soldiers are standing over blacks and blacks groveling on the ground. They identify with the people. So there is a difference there.
By the way, since we're talking, this is within 2 weeks after the atrocities, and we'd like to figure how these atrocities happened, who did what in Zaire that made all the headlines, with the Marxist-backed, as we get it in the headlines, the Marxist-backed rebels committed the atrocities against women and kids, white and black. And you're indicating something that Mobutu, our man in Zaire, have been guilty of much of this.
Oh, absolutely. But remember that the present situation in the Shaba tracks directly from 3 previous CIA covert actions. We installed Mobutu in power. We set up a UN operation.
When we installed Mobutu in power, we helped knock off Lumumba some time ago.
We helped. We plotted the death of Lumumba. We juggled other politicians out of office. We picked our man, Mobutu. We mounted a UN operation to suppress a secession, pro-Western secession, as a matter of fact, of the Katanga. And as a result of that military operation, the Katangese were chased across the border into exile. And they are now Black Africa's Palestinians. They're out of their country. Meanwhile, Mobutu has raped the Katanga of its resources, its money, and his paracommandos have gone through the place every year or two with terrorism, pillage, looting, rape, brutal suppression of the area. So periodically the Katangese want to come back in. They've fought originally they were very much pro-West, but since we continue to support Mobutu against them, now they're getting support from the Cubans. They'll take it.
Now, the point I'm trying to figure out is, we hear talk about the media through the years, the media, the left media, which is one of the gags of all time. You have radio and TV, whether it's Today's Show, Tonight's Show, whether it's anything, the news, it's about the depredations and that we got to stop somehow. There's a righteous air, must stop. What are we going to do about the depredations of the Soviets and the Cubans? Now, aren't the commentators up on what you're talking about now?
Well, it's very hard for these people to get a feeling. They're gullible, if you'll permit me. They're gullible to what's happened in the Shaba. There were photographs of the atrocities committed by Mobutu's paracommandos at the time in the last 2 weeks. It's hard to put a figure on how many were killed by Mobutu's own soldiers, but it probably is about 1/3 of the total killed in the Shaba in the last, I guess it's 3 weeks already.
Well, Kissinger's gone, but Brzezinski's there.
Same mentality. This mentality, this militaristic, stir up the world mentality is still dominant. Carter is listening to the wrong people. He should listen to Andrew Young more and Brzezinski less.
Before we take a break, we've got to act out the Kissinger grunt, because
okay.
now
remember,
here's the meeting. Here's the gathering.
And the point is that we've got a proposal here to introduce American advisors into the conflict. Now, this is a significant escalation of the war.
Okay. And they're asking, what did Kissinger say? He's about to head for China now, isn't he?
He's about to take off for China.
And he's not here. So these are big shots all gathered. And you are there.
Yeah.
Finally, Mulcahy spoke. He didn't exactly say anything. We'll alternate.
Let's start back up here. It says, Potts, the Africa Division chief, turns to Ambassador Mulcahy and says, well, Ed, what did Kissinger say?
Mulcahy tamped his pipe and sucked on it for a few moments, apparently having trouble framing an answer. Potts watched him quietly. Finally, Mulcahy spoke.
He didn't exactly say anything.
Did he read the paper?
Oh, yes. I took it to him myself just a few minutes before he left for China. I insisted that he read it.
You mean he didn't make any comment? He just read it and took off? Potts looked baffled, exasperated.
Mulcahy nodded ruefully. He read it, then he grunted and walked out of the office.
Grunted?
Yeah, like, Mulcahy grunted to...
But he's going to be gone 10 days, Potts scowled. What are we supposed to do in Angola in the meantime? We have to make some decisions today.
Mulcahy shrugged, helpless. They looked at each other.
Well, was it a positive grunt or a negative? But is this true?
This is absolutely true. This is absolutely true.
Was it a positive grunt or a negative grunt?
It was just a grunt, like, it didn't go up or down.
And now, writes Stockwell, this group of somber men was supervising the country's only current war. They were gathered to discuss steps that could affect world peace. No one was smiling. Mulcahy grunted again, emphasizing a flat sound. Down the table, someone else tried it, experimenting with the sound of a positive grunt, and then a negative one, his voice rising and then falling. Others attempted it, while Potts and Mulcahy watched.
Well, Potts said, do we proceed with the advisors?
Mulcahy scowled and puffed on his pipe, uncomfortable in his position as Kissinger's surrogate. Well, we better not, he said finally. Kissinger just decided not to send Americans into the Sinai. And everyone nodded in agreement. Inaction was safe, easier to correct. Now, and the meeting proceeded, and then it goes on. Now we come to the question about the grunt. You're describing this as it happened.
Absolutely. That scene absolutely happened. I sat there watching it and just like a spectator to Catch-22 or something. I couldn't believe it.
Well, this is out of the Marx Brothers and W.C. Fields,
Yeah. Well, at the outset of this program, when I and Carl Bantam and the others were sick at our stomachs what we were doing, I had been in the field, and I had never seen how these things were run from Washington. And I was terribly disillusioned with what we'd done in Vietnam, but I was hoping that by sitting on the subcommittee of the National Security Council, I would see a wisdom in our operations that would make me feel that these things did have a justification which the public didn't understand. Unfortunately, I saw decisions made on the basis of things like the Kissinger grunt, and I came away even more disillusioned.
This would be hilarious if it weren't so tragic, really.
Yeah.
And we're talking to John Stockwell, who was the former CIA Angola Task Force chief. And In Search of Enemies, the title itself, In Search of Enemies, speaks for itself, but he does more than that. He cites chapter and verse in it. Norton, the publishers. And we'll resume more of the conversation reflections of John Stockwell in a moment after this message. And so we resume the conversation, and someone will ask, why did you decide to blow the whistle? They'll probably ask you that. You've been asked that many times.
Well, it was a complex situation. After the war was wound down, I waited for 6 months, during which time I just mulled. I had to give up a career in order to expose what had happened. I had to be willing to take the heat from the government, which may yet come. And I had to be absolutely sure that my assessment was right. And I wouldn't want to write such a book like that unless it were letter perfect, totally accurate. And it took me about 6 months to get myself in a mental set where I thought that it had to be done. At the same time, I analyzed all of my other options, and I had been a good case officer because I could recruit people and assure them that I believed in total sincerity that what we were doing was worthwhile and that we would back up our promises and commitments to people. In Vietnam, we had dumped a lot of people that we had unnecessarily exposed with unprofessional activity. And I knew I could never go back to the field with the CIA and recruit anyone again. We dumped people in Vietnam, and there was no way that I could sincerely sit down and tell someone that he was in good hands by working for the CIA.
You describe a CIA case, by agents are those who were used. You'd be a case officer. There's a difference.
Right.
The agents are very often the ones who are in great danger. CIA case officers hardly.
Rarely is a case officer. He's got a black diplomatic passport. He can pop out of the country on a plane anytime the heat's
By the way, since you're talking about that, we know the death of Welsh, and much was made of the death of, whom was tragic, of course, for his wife and children. But they say because of his being exposed and named, he was killed, and the CIA, of course, now had a great argument. You're pointing out that hardly does it, that on the contrary, the KGB never exposed CIA. They work hand in hand. You indicate CIA and KGB guys.
They socialize extensively. There's camaraderie and rapport. They will recruit each other, but I never saw them doing anything nasty to each other. Yeah, if you're a KGB officer and you're disaffected and you want to work for the CIA, I'll set it up for you, and no doubt vice versa. But we didn't see, I never saw the KGB shafting us or vice versa. Never happened.
Because both these guys do the same kind of work, don't they?
Yeah.
I mean, both these guys, it's a Parkinson's law at work. Their jobs depend upon hostilities, don't they?
Yes, oh yes.
About keeping it going.
Oh yes, the function, keeping the function going of the intelligence business.
And so it's to their benefit to have hostilities.
The sad thing is that right after World War II, America had pretty good credibility. Rarely has a dominant country had so much credibility around the world. The world was afraid of the communist threat, the KGB, these goons, the sadists without any moral laws. So what did we do? We set up the CIA, as we wrote in the memos at the time, that we had to learn to be more inhuman than they were. And we succeeded. Now
Is that what the memos?
Yeah, for example, a memo by former President Hoover. He headed a commission to study this, and he says in those words that we should learn to be more brutal and more inhuman, if you will.
Oh, my God, you have it here. I think perhaps you should read that.
Well, let's read that, the exact words of the memo. This is the justification for forming the CIA and for keeping it going. In the Hoover Commission report of 1954, the CIA had been in action for 7 years at this point, but they're re-examining it, and here's what they said. There are no rules in such a game. Hitherto acceptable norms of human conduct do not apply. If the U.S. is to survive, long-standing American concepts of fair play must be reconsidered. We must develop effective espionage and counter-espionage services. We must learn to subvert, sabotage, and destroy by more clever, more sophisticated, and more effective methods than those used against us. It may become necessary that the American people be acquainted with, understand, and support this fundamentally repugnant philosophy. Well, see, what we've done is we succeeded. We created the CIA in the image of the KGB to the point where now the world generally acknowledges that we succeeded, that Americans are just as dirty as the KGB. Forget the credibility we had at the end of World War II.
That's really winning, isn't it?
Yeah. This is basically why I wrote this book, was because the CIA is permitted to perform its violent function and lead the United States into these situations, and we lose. The CIA's role in leading us into the Vietnam War, originally with Bill Colby as the chief of Station Saigon in 59 and 60. Propagandizing the American public, manipulating the economy, installing someone we liked in office and then plucking them out and killing them. This is thoroughly documented. Look what it led to.
Of course, Chile's a good case in point.
Chile is a good case in point. This Operation Mongoose War against Cuba is a great deal.
Operation Mongoose?
Yeah, in the early 60s, the CIA's largest station, with its greatest single budget for one station, was directed against destabilizing Cuba politically and its economy and trying to kill Castro.
Oh, no, it's very much to what we succeeded in doing in Chile is what we tried to do in Cuba.
Yes, and we didn't succeed. We didn't kill Castro, and we didn't succeed in disrupting his government. which in itself is a tribute to the effectiveness of the CIA or the ineffectiveness of the CIA. But the problems we're having in Africa right now with Castro not, we attacked his shorelines with terrorism. We had teams going in there raiding and blowing up every night for years. And he doesn't love us now. We ask him to get out of Africa. Why should he listen to us? What have we ever done for him besides attack him militarily?
You have a long footnote here about, involving Clark Clifford. Now, Clark Clifford was one of the guys who helped form the CIA as it is now. But his point is for purposes of intelligence. He's for a complete dismantling of it, isn't he? Or at least reconstruction of it.
He certainly has come out now admitting that it was a mistake to create the covert action, to give the CIA the charter for covert action, and urging that we take covert action away from the CIA.
And think about the options. Throughout, you're hitting here, the option of staying out never occurred. There are options. The option of peace is the one that was never considered.
Well, it's not the CIA's function to present a peaceful solution anywhere in the world. The CIA's function is to present the violent options. For example, now in Cuba, in Cuba in '59, we didn't go. The CIA didn't go to President Eisenhower and then to Kennedy and say, our best course down there is to establish relations with Castro, peacify him, stabilize the area, and try and sort of soften him on his Marxist bent. Instead, we went in and said, look, we've got an army of Cuban exiles that will do anything we ask them to do. We've got a base of operations in Guatemala. We've got all of these surplus planes and things we can get our hands on. And we've got intelligence that the people in Cuba will rise up and support anything we do. This intelligence was later proven false. But presto, we've got a Bay of Pigs. The presidents, being gullible and aggressive and ignorant, said, sure, fine. They hit the button. They signed the paper or whatever, and the CIA launched its operation, which led to the Bay of Pigs fiasco and the Operation Mongoose War, which has haunted us until this day.
So, in a sense, we tried the same thing in Angola.
Oh, yes.
So it's not accidental that Castro is in Angola. He sees himself. He's Angola's Cuba.
Oh, absolutely. He was delighted to go into Angola in response to our operation, in response to the South African invasion, to have the chance to meet us in the battlefield.
We
and
did cooperate with South Africa.
Oh, yes, we did indeed. Former Director Colby has tried to confuse that issue, but the CIA's documents and the papers to the National Security Council abundantly documented close military cooperation with South Africa.
Well, I'm talking, in case you're wondering who I'm talking to, it's not a Soviet agent. It's John Stockwell, who's the former CIA chief of the Angola Task Force. And he worked a CIA man in Vietnam, former member of the Marines, recruited, and lived as a small boy in Zaire. Or what was that, in the Congo?
In the Congo, it was
And so
called,
you knew something of the culture and something of
If there's anyone in this equation that's pro-Soviet in terms of helping the United States or hurting them, it's the CIA itself. Its activities have caused us more grief. I'm trying to point out to the American public that behind these barriers of clandestinity, the CIA isn't very effective, and it gets us in a lot of trouble. It makes the United States weaker in these various corners of the world.
One of the ironies, is Angola, Zaire, important as far as the national security of the U.S. is concerned?
Well, Zaire has a lot of copper and cobalt, and right now, Zaire owes us $400 million, which obviously we're never going to see again if they can't get their copper out. So Zaire is probably more important to us than Angola strategically. Angola controls the railroad that Zaire gets its copper out. However, our marriage to this Mobutu fellow in Zaire has gotten us time and again into trouble with a lot of other countries in the world that are probably just as important. Right now, we're putting in a joint force in the Shaba, which we're going to fund. And they're going to be Moroccans doing the shooting, and Americans are going to be there to coordinate the communications and logistics. Just think what will happen if this escalates, if the Soviets and the Cubans choose to continue the confrontation with us there, and they answer with a larger force of their own, and we wind up putting in American troops, American advisors they would call them first, and then American troops. So do
you think American people would go for that now?
We would have American soldiers shooting blacks in Africa with 40% of our army black. If this continued, was escalated the way these things tend to, the way they did in Vietnam, Vietnam would look like a Sunday school picnic by comparison.
Well, there's a big postulate, assumption. Would the American people go for that?
Well, that's what I mean.
Yeah.
Domestically,
Yeah.
the damage this would do to our
Yeah.
country in terms of antagonizing our black populations.
But how many
Would
soldiers
be-
would be recruited to go is what I mean. How many would go? That's the thing.
I don't know what would happen if we
Yeah.
put a military unit on the ground and they had to shoot at Katangis, shoot blacks over there. I hope that the brinksmanship that they're playing now, that somebody will put some pressure on them to pull back.
You know, you mentioned Mobutu, the guy we put in. You have several sequences dealing with the death of Lumumba, and you have one scene that is absolutely incredible, in which someone you describe, an acquaintance of yours, describes how he carried Lumumba's body. Now, what role do we play in the assassination of Lumumba?
Well, this officer was down in a province, and he addressed my class in training, and he said that he just threw this out, and then I didn't have a chance. Then he finished his lecture and left, but he said, just describing the adventures he'd gotten into, and he says, and driving around town in Lubumbashi with Lumumba's body in the trunk of my car, and left this little thing dangling. I made a note about it, and then he left this little thing dangling, unanswered. The role that we played in the assassination of Lumumba is documented in testimony given to the church committee, and then various other things in the public record. We plotted his death in late 1960. He was a radical. He was talking about new concepts in this newly independent country. The plot went so far that we developed special poisons that would be given to him, and Sid Gottlieb, the head of the CIA's Technical Services Division, flew the poisons to Kinshasa, then called Leopoldville, where the station had agreed that it would find a way to administer them. Now the station chickened out at the end because it couldn't find a way to do the deed without being implicated. You couldn't throw a cocktail party and have Lumumba come to it and then have him die 2 hours later. You know, it just wouldn't work. So they sent the poison back. It's documented that they had discussed the problem that Lumumba presented and how that his elimination might be necessary with people, our allies, Zairians, who were politicians who were friendly to us. 5 weeks later, Lumumba was put on a plane and beaten to death by strongmen who worked for those politicians. Now, there is a gap there in that there is not a CIA cable which says, I just told so-and-so to beat him to death tonight. But I am personally convinced that Lumumba wouldn't have died if we hadn't been in there promoting it.
Who was this guy who boasted having carried Lumumba's body in the trunk of his car?
You mean his identity?
No, I mean,
Yeah.
what was his job?
He was a CIA case officer who was among the mob of people over there. And I don't know what, he may not even have had a title at that time.
You know, there's so many strings here to this bow that is utterly mad. The 40 Committee. We hear talk about the 40 Committee, part of the National Security Council, whose representatives are very often on television these days. National Security Council. What's the 40 Committee?
Well, the 40 Committee, it's now called the Operations Advisory Group. About the end of my book, it's changed the Operations Advisory Group. It's the subcommittee of the National Security Council that is supposed to supervise the CIA's covert action. That is, it represents the CIA to the president. It's the link between the president and the CIA, and the other heads of departments of the government meet to agree or disagree with things like the Angola War or the Bay of Pigs invasion. Now, sometimes, in many cases, it comes to the CIA with word from the president or from Kissinger or Brzezinski saying, we want this situation in the world taken care of. In other situations, the CIA goes to it and says, we've got an idea. And then in other situations, the CIA runs operations without getting the 40 Committee's approval, without telling them. And in at least one situation that I document in the book, it goes beyond its charter and does things that the 40 Committee has decided it should not do.
Oh, boy. We haven't talked about mercenaries, have we? And that played a role, too, isn't it?
The whole concept, which we've done repeatedly to support Mobutu and keep him in power, the whole concept of using European mercenaries, whites, who relinquished their hold on these African countries with some residue of bitterness by the Africans, to hire these people to
You
go
mean like
in.
French mercenaries? You mean the
French-
Foreign Legion that has now become
Exactly.
heroic?
French, Belgian, British.
The Foreign
mercenaries.
Legion, about 9/10 of it was ex-Nazis to begin with.
Yeah.
We know that. It's fairly common knowledge.
Tough, brutal soldiers and adventurers. We've used these people repeatedly down in Africa to be our champions in the battlefield. This is absolute foolishness, because these people are brutal. They are inevitably, they include psychotics who do crime, murder, and rape and pillage, and they don't fight very well. And one situation in the Congo in 1963-64, they did solve a problem there, but they could drive into the rebels were armed with bows and arrows. And the mercenaries could drive into a village with a truck with a 50 caliber machine gun on the back and clear out the village. But in the fighting situations, they don't fight very well.
We haven't talked about, and I think that's one of the most important things of all, since the news is what we hear and what we read and what we see. Use of journalists. Seeing the use of journalists.
Oh, yeah. Of course, the use of American journalists by the CIA has been documented, and that's a separate story. And I'm told that has been curtailed to a certain extent. But during this Angola War, we were running propaganda operations right here in the United States, where we were putting false information into American newspapers to convince Americans that our cause, the CIA's cause, in Angola was right. Now, this means that we were using American tax dollars to secretly plant articles in the hands of journalists or in American newspapers and television to plant false stories, to create a false impression in Americans' minds about what really happened over there, so that we could continue to do what we wanted to do.
Hey, you're talking about the world press dutifully picked up Lusaka. Lusaka was where Roberto's forces were?
No, Lusaka primarily supported Savimbi's forces.
Savimbi, the third.
Savimbi's outside base.
And so we pick up Lusaka's story of Soviet advisors while we're headquarters watch nervously, preferring the propaganda ploys have at least some basis in fact. And it's being picked up. David Ottaway of the Washington Post got it from Savimbi's guys, and a big story is printed. And then it comes out, it's about they captured some Soviet advisors, and it turns out they didn't capture any.
No, this is pure fabrication.
But nonetheless, the original story is one that's the headline story all the time. Another Lusaka fabricator accused Cuban soldiers of committing atrocities in Angola. It mentioned rape and pillage. And then its stories became more specific, reporting a totally fictitious incident in which Cuban soldiers raped some Ovimbundu girls. Subsequently, it wrote that some of these same soldiers had been captured and tried for a tribunal of Ubundu women. Lusaka kept the story going endlessly throughout the program. Later, Carol Murphy, a Washington Post stringer who had covered Luanda where the MPLA forces were.
And where the Cubans were.
Where the Cubans were. Told me Cuban soldiers had, she told us to you,
yes,
universally fallen in love with Angola and were singularly well behaved. The only atrocities able to document had Cubans as victims rather than criminals. 16 Cuban soldiers captured in October executed by UNITA soldiers at the end of the war.
Well, these were examples.
This is too much.
Yeah. That story, by the way, was replayed in a number of U.S. newspapers. I picked these
Which
as examples.
Which story? You mean the
about
one?
the Cuban rapists.
Uh-huh.
These were examples I picked to illustrate the sort of things that our propagandists fabricated and got into American newspapers.
Before the hour is up, I know much more you have to say. I'd have to have you read the last part. Senator Dick Clark, a good man out of Iowa, I know is quite serious, but mad. Now he was kind of but he was kind of painted into a corner by the CIA, wasn't he?
Yeah, he was. We gave him false information. We distracted him. But the interesting thing is that when a senator, this is why the Senate oversight doesn't work. When a senator is briefed by the CIA, he gives his oath of secrecy. If he goes public with that information later, his peers, the rules that govern in Washington, he'll be ostracized. He has to play the secrets game. So the CIA can muzzle anyone it wants by briefing them, in effect, anyone in the Senate. call them in, give them a top secret briefing, and then they can't go public. And of course the Senate can't function, our system of government cannot function, particularly in something like the waging of war or approving a budget, without public debate.
And so public debate is stifled.
Public debate is stifled. The CIA can give senators false briefings, not even tell them the truth, mislead them, and the senators still can't go public and gain support and make people aware of what's happening.
And so this is a case where Pike was shafted, Harrington rather was shafted, Congressman Harrington was shafted as a result of that. The time he was head of the committee, remember, and that he leaked things, he betrayed something.
That's right, and he was, I understand he was broken partially because of that.
Yeah.
That was a year or two before this.
But in the meantime, the guys are called the two happiness boys, Kissinger and Moynihan, are going to town. And,
they're going public, giving speeches, issuing press releases, which are false, but designed to gain support for the Angola program. The senators who know the truth or suspect the truth can't go public.
In what way, just to pin it down further, John Stockwell, my guest, in what way are the comments of Kissinger and Moynihan false?
Well, they're hammering away, for example, at the idea that we've got to stop the Soviets in Angola, for one thing, claiming that the United States has steadfastly supported an embargo against arms and fighting in Angola, when in fact we were up front in escalating the war.
So here's this quote, if I could just read this paragraph of yours. The CIA intensified its propaganda efforts, its agents focusing on New York and Washington. And, of course, it's very effective because that's what the congressmen and senators are, those who vote on it. Our United Nations ambassador, Daniel Patrick Moynihan, at the time ambassador, now U.S. senator, noisily accused the Soviets of attempting to colonize Africa. And you said at the time we were there all the time. Kissinger huffed publicly, but had to be extremely tough, even brutal, when they, the Soviets, step over the line. And then here's the part. The senators could not answer publicly, muzzled as they were by the CIA. Senator Dick Clark, for example.
And John Tunney and others.
Well, so this is and Clark pointed out in Angola we're dangerously close to an open-ended confrontation with the Soviet Union, a country that is of no real strategic concern to either country. So we come back to the madness again, don't we? Well, any other reflection of yours before the hour is up, and ask you to perhaps read the last passage of the book?
Well, it's just probably in the last passage that the CIA, in my own conclusion, is the CIA has been a net loss to the United States in our foreign affairs. The United States would be stronger overseas if the CIA had not existed.
I think read any part of that, the part that is toward the end of the book. John Stockwell is my guest, the former CIA chief of the Angola Task Force. His book is In Search of Enemies, published by Morrow.
Well, going back to the Hoover Commission report, which we just read, where we're supposed to learn to subvert and sabotage more cleverly than the KGB, and then we say at the end that the American people may have to be made acquainted with this fundamentally repugnant philosophy. I say, this was a tragic, fallacious thesis. Our survival as a free people has obviously not been dependent on the fumbling activities of the clandestine services of the CIA, but on the dynamism of our economic system and the competitive energies of our people. Nor was Hoover's philosophy fundamentally repugnant. Rather, it was irresistible, for it created an exhilarating new game where all social and legal restraints were dissolved. Cast as super patriots, there were no rules, no controls, no laws, no moral restraints, and no civil rights for the CIA game players. No individual in the world would be immune to their depredations. Friends could be shafted and enemies destroyed without compunction. It was an experiment in amorality, a real-life fantasy island to which presidents, legislators, and the American people could escape vicariously.
And perhaps the last paragraph of your book.
Already we are paying dearly for indulging ourselves. As we have succeeded in making ourselves more like our enemies, more like the KGB, the world has taken note. Throughout Africa, Latin America, and Asia at least, every legitimate American businessman, teacher, and official is suspiciously viewed as a probable CIA operative, capable of dangerous betrayals. The world knows that, in fact, numbers of actual CIA case officers are posing as just such people while they recruit agents, bribe officials, and support covert adventures. The positive contribution of such activity to our national security is dubious. But mounting numbers of victims, the millions of people whose lives have been trampled or splattered by CIA operations, are increasingly cynical of America. Because of the CIA, the world is a more dangerous place. Americans have reduced credibility. Worst of all, by retaining the CIA, we are accepting ourselves as a harsh and ruthless people. It's the wrong game for a great nation, and the players we've got are losers.
John Stockwell, last passage of the book. Thank you very much. It's In Search of Enemies, Norton, the publishers. It's available. Thank you.
And thank you very much.